and welcome to LawPod. I'm Professor Aoife O'Donoghue, and today we're joined by Dr. Ruth Houghton and Julie Morrissey. And today we're going to talk to Julie about her work as a poet, as an academic, and as an artist. Julie is an Irish poet, academic, activist, and a graduate of UCD Law. From 2021 to 22, she was the first poet in residence at the National Library of Ireland. Her award-winning project, Certain Individual Women, uses poetry to examine gender discrimination in Irish legislation and the Bunreacht, the 1937 constitution in Ireland. Her awards include the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Make Theatre Award, and the Arts Council of Ireland's Next Generation Award. Our other guest today is Dr. Ruth Houghton of Newcastle University Law School. And Ruth has published extensively on feminist approaches to international law, on constituent power, on the IMF and democracy, and asks fundamental questions about the way that we imagine constitutionalism domestically, internationally, and regionally. So thank you both for agreeing to come along today. I'm delighted to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
So myself and Ruth are going to go, interrogate poor Julie here slightly. And go through a few questions to talk and discuss and explore her work. And for our student listeners in particular, I think they would be really, interested in the idea that you're a law graduate. And could you explain how you went from doing law at UCD to becoming a poet?
Yeah, sure thing. It's a bit of an unusual journey. So I never really intended to be a practicing lawyer and never have been. I got my law degree, which I really enjoyed studying law, but I guess at the time I wasn't very aware of the kind of more various avenues there were for working within law without being a kind of a corporate lawyer, which is the kind of message I was getting at the time, that's what you could do with your law degree. And that's what all my peers were trying to get into, like big five law firms. And I knew that definitely was not the route that I wanted to go. So I just thought, okay, well, I guess I won't be doing law then. So after I got my degree, I spent about 6 or 7 years outside of university, and I was living in Canada and I was writing. And then I decided that I would go back and kind of more formally study creative writing. So I went back to university to do a master's in creative writing and then a master's in literature and then a PhD in creative writing.
Kind of following on from that, and I suppose it makes sense from what you've been saying, but why do you think law has such a resonance in your work? Like, how do you go about thinking about your work? Like, do you think that having the law degree impacts on it? Or is that kind of us projecting, because we interact with the law all the time, obviously as legal academics, is that us projecting law onto your work? Or does having the law degree make a difference? Or is it happen to grow up on this island where being a woman and law is inevitably interlinked?
I don't think you're projecting, first of all. I think I've realized this the further I've gone into academia myself, actually, is particularly in literary studies, that I really think and write like a lawyer because I was trained to write like a lawyer. And part of what we do in poetry, as poets, is actually quite similar to the study of law in the way that we look at texts. And close reading, I think, is something that you're also taught as a lawyer. And you're taught about compositional choices, and you're taught to be analytical and precise and to pay attention to the kind of economy of language in very, very similar ways that poets think about language, maybe with different outcomes in mind. But the actual kind of drafting and compositional elements and interpretation and expression is very similar to how we look at legal documents as lawyers. So I don't think it's actually that big of a stretch. And there's lots of lawyer poets, actually, once you start looking. There's many, many of us, which is maybe seems weird, but when you think about all those similarities, maybe makes sense. I think about poetry as a kind of what Lynn Higinian, the American poet, might call the language of inquiry. So I think about it as a way of figuring through ideas or concepts and asking questions, which really, I guess, is the same as what lawyers do.
That's really fascinating because I come at it from the other way around to you. So I originally did English and history as my first degree. so English literature and history, and then went on to do my law qualification and then became a legal academic. So I completely agree that the synergies between the literary and law and the way you're trained to read doing a literature degree is so useful to how you're then trained to read as a lawyer.
I mean, when I was doing my master's in literature, that was the first time I studied English in university. And I remember when I started turning in papers, one of the professors kind of took me aside and said, there's something about the way that you write and it's not wrong, but I don't know what it is. And this is not how we write in English. What did you do before this? And I said, oh, I did law. And she said, oh, yeah. Okay. She's like, that's exactly. She's like, you're trying to make like an argument. So, yeah. And I've never really gotten away from that. Like I can't fully switch into the common conventions for literary scholarship. I still have the kind of legal conventions and I can't quite get away from it.
I think too it impacts on the way you frame problems as well. Kind of the legal training is you see problems through a particular lens and you construct the answer through a particular lens. I think simply because the training, I don't think we realise when we're doing it or even as we're doing it as teachers, that how much of it is about training people to think and write in a very particular way. And I think it probably comes through all the time, I think, in everything that we do. And it's interesting what you're saying about writing, because I think from various projects we've done about when we're, as academic writers, asked to write things other than academic articles, we find it really hard. So even in feminist judgments projects, like people found that really, really hard, and finding their voice as a judge really hard. Or with kind of the feminist manifestos with students, and I asked them, they did some amazing, in law and gender, some amazing manifestos, but that was a really big leap for them to write in another way, because it's sort of the almost giving yourself permission to write in another form, even though you're still using the background law, but taking that a different form even was, I think, quite. It remains, I think, quite a leap in stuff I do, but in teaching as well and with students.
Yeah. So I guess thinking then about what law does and how law is written versus how law is performed. So there's an excellent quote in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, and it struck us that this is a great way of kind of thinking through how the law is and is performed and is a performance. And so the quote is, "When you are writing laws, you are testing words to find their utmost power. Like spells, they have to make things happen in the real world. And like spells, they only work if people believe in them." And so we were wondering then how this might resonate with how you think about law in your own work.
I think that's a great quotation, and there's so much in it, because law does make things happen. And I think that's really important to understand when we're looking at legal language. There are actual kind of material consequences to the language of law. And I'm kind of interested in what happens when we move that language into different spaces or in different directions, and how that can test its meaning or parameters, and how we might interpret it differently when we're looking at maybe legal language as poetry as we would if we're looking at legal language in the context of law. And I also think the kind of formulation of the spell and law as a spell is really interesting, partly because, to me, a spell has some kind of additional dimension, like something that is outside of ourselves somehow. And I really agree that people think about law like that, almost as if it's something that's been kind of handed to us and that we didn't make it ourselves. And I think that's kind of risky, because, there can be this kind of legal fetishism where we see the law as this kind of thing that is given to us and not something that we made ourselves and that we can change or have an impact on. So the spell part, I think, is really true about the way people think about law. But I think that it's really important for people to have a sense of kind of agency about law, and to kind of, I suppose it is important that we all believe in it, but also believe that we can change it if it's something that isn't working for us.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I guess that's kind of like how we've been thinking through our work with manifestos and the way in which feminist activists or feminist writers will use the manifesto as a way of kind of showing the extent to which the law doesn't recognize them, but also how they might then assert then the need for reform or the need for change through the kind of the manifesto form, that agency that you were kind of talking about.
Yeah, because I think too, I was just saying about being able to change it, and that idea of it being a spell as in something handed down to you by somebody who has some sort of wisdom that you don't have. And that, I think when it comes to things like constitutions, it's written by forefathers, as always forefathers, but that they had some sort of knowledge. And I was just so on social media, Donald Coffey, who's Maynooth, was looking at the exam results of the people who wrote the 1922 Constitution and discovered that one of them had failed all their third year exams. And sort of, this idea that we imbue them with this sort of great expertise, and 10 years after failing all your exams in your final year, you're writing a constitution, so there's the sort of what we think people who write those things and do those things and create those spells and hand them down to us, they're often not actually, they don't have this sort of knowledge or legal wit that we're all not capable of having as well.
I don't know if you've ever gone to see De Valera's papers, the drafts of the Constitution. They're in the UCD archive, and I've gone to see them, obviously. And that's what strikes me when you go to look at the drafts. This is a person imagining this monumental document and going through it and making little changes and making notes and adding things in and taking them out in the same way that I might draft a poem or something, but obviously with much greater consequence. But still, at the end of the day, it's a person or a group of people kind of sitting down together and making this thing that's going to be foundational for the state. But there is a kind of a sense that there's an element of magic or wisdom that I'm guessing wasn't really there. They did what they could at the time, I suppose.
Yeah, like we all do.
Yeah. It's not magic.
It's not magic.
Law is not magic.
No,
I think that's important for us to remember, because then it makes it more graspable to think about changing it.
Yeah, I think with the magic is also when people get sworn into office and things, that there's this or when you're doing jury duty or anything like that, where there's a sort of the kind of performance of that celebrate, or the opening of Parliament. Another great example of the sort of the pageantry to go along with it that makes it even more sort of, even if we know that all of those rituals were created, and we know that they were all created, but see, we still sort of the pageantry of it. Even graduations, I think, in universities in some ways have that same sort of magic of performance, and add a bit of Latin.
And poetry.
And poetry.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's another way that law and poetry weirdly comes together in this kind of ceremonial use, which again adds to this idea of poets and lawyers maybe as kind of somewhat magic people.
I'd like to think
myself
in magic. I was really taken, as you know, I've mentioned it to you before, with Radical, the work that you did when you were in the National Library of Ireland, and the relationships and sort of in the women in that kind of revolutionary period when Northern Ireland and Ireland were created, and the way that you sort of interwove your language with their language and their writings with each other. And what it struck me as well, and it sort of goes back to the work myself and Ruth were doing when I was reading the manifestos, that I always have a very emotional reaction when I'm reading that kind of material, because I feel like particularly the women are kind of speaking across time, and I think to each other at the time, but also to now, that the sort of hearing their voices. But I thought it was in the pamphlet, sort of the way those voices, making again or rehearing again, or kind of to voices that weren't heard at the time, or went unheard or unheeded maybe, or not listened to, or only listened to by each other. And I was sort of wondering about how you approach your work, and particularly in that kind of where we're talking about women's voices who were involved in the creation of what is now this island, and the way that this island in Northern Ireland and the Republic operates, but who don't come into that narrative or that story that we tell.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of women speaking to each other across time. And that also happens in certain individual women, because it's kind of this figure of my grandmother and myself speaking to each other over the same kind of 100-year period, I guess, that Radical is reflecting on, because my grandmother was born in 1921 on the week the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. So we're talking about women of a kind of a similar-ish age. And I'm interested in that first 100 years, of the state, and what, what the ambitions of the women were versus what ended up happening. And I suppose more particularly what women of that generation would think about womanhood in Ireland now. I've often had conversations about radical where people will say things like, oh, those women were so ahead of their time. But I actually don't know if they thought of themselves as ahead of their time. I think that they felt that everything that they were asking for was completely just and right and should be happening, and not even like a question that they should have to be asking for it. That, that was kind of an understanding that how the state would be formed on the basis of equality for everyone. And I sometimes think, were they really ahead of their time, or are we just kind of sadly behind ours?
That is quite stark, isn't it? That
yeah, it's a bit grim.
But we're not. But I use a quote from it that I'm trying to remember which woman it was, but that she was lonely for them, that she was lonely for the other women, and for me that really struck me as being lonely for it. But the life that in those 100 years that we lost, that the things that they were naturally asking for at the time, which they just all should have gotten. But that there was an alternative world, almost parallel world, where that actually happened.
Yeah.
And that like that being lonely, I was like, I'm lonely for that other thing that they thought they were getting or wanted to get or were arguing for. They kind of it created a real sense of loss in me when I was reading it, because I was like, oh, that's great articulation of what I felt.
And I think, one of the things that I came to realize through doing the Radical Project was how rich and deep the Irish feminist tradition is, because I also did a lot of work for Repeal. And I think it's no surprise to me, knowing that now, that those networks have been there since then and probably before then. And I was talking to Liz Gillis, who does a lot of work around the revolutionary period as well, like amazing work about the women of that period. And, she was just kind of explaining to me that, the women who were involved in the revolution continued on being activists, either in their own communities in a kind of a local way, or in a more public way, like Kathleen Clarke being the first Lord Mayor of Dublin. So that those women continued for the next 100 years to be the kind of radical feminist activists that they were at that point. And then when you think about things like Repeal, to me it seems like, well, no wonder there was such a strong movement there, because the networks and the impulse and the kind of knowledge of how to shape a movement like that was there somewhere. We were drawing on something that was already there,
Yeah.
So I think that I felt a bit silly when I, when I kind of realized, oh, there was already a template for this. This already exists. It was in the way that women have been thinking in Ireland for the last 100 years. And we're just picking it back up,
But that's where radical is really important, right? Because it brings you back to that moment and gets you to ask those kind of questions, right? It gets you into that and go like, well, those women, as you say, they did continue on, and they were really important in the 1937 Constitution, and they were really important in Belfast, for instance, and education and healthcare, in shaping things. It's just that, but you kind of need the point to go back and go, oh, actually, what did they? Oh, they did this thing and that thing and did amazing.
And ideally, you'd be taught that in school or something.
You would, yeah.
Or in law school.
Yeah.
Well, which the law pod, I suppose, is doing.
Because one of the things that we found when we were reading a lot of the feminist manifestos for our project was the extent to which those feminist manifestos speak to each other as well. And so we often approach manifestos as these kind of individual claims written by single individual men. And yet actually the feminist manifestos tend to be written collectively and also speaking both to those masculine manifestos, but also to each other. And doing some further research then, specifically in Japan, but I'm sure there's examples elsewhere, that at the kind of the end of the 19th century, women in Japan were excluded from politics. They weren't allowed to be part of political groups. And so they turned to poetry as a way of expressing their need for legal reform. And so they have these poems that are manifestos where they are claiming space for women and asking for legal and constitutional change. And so, the manifesto as a poem, I guess the question then for you as the poet, could there be a poetic constitution?
I mean, that's incredible. I didn't know that about the Japanese women, and I'm very excited to read it. And such a great example of finding space where you have not been given space, right? Finding space to express something in a kind of a material way through text and language where you have not been afforded that space. And I think the idea of a poetic constitution doesn't seem that wild to me. It's partly what I'm doing, I suppose, in revisiting the Bunreacht and scrutinizing the language and writing poems from the language and from the legislation that came out of that language. So, as we said about kind of thinking about writing a constitution, it's kind of an inspiring thing to be part of. And, in the Republic, we have a poet as the president. So for me, I kind of think there's no reason that poets couldn't be involved in constitutional writing. I mean, the last one was partly written with a priest or archbishop.
Yeah.
So I'm like, why, if you suggest that now, I think people would think, no, we shouldn't do that. But why not a poet? Why not have, and not just poets, like why not have something that is more kind of collective and community driven that could maybe get into those areas of exclusion that exist in the Bunreacht in ways that just hasn't been possible, at least like to imagine it, at least in some kind of experimental way. I don't think, because I guess the Constitution itself, when it was being written, as we're saying, like was kind of an experiment. They didn't really know what they were doing.
No, and they really didn't. And I think, and you can there's lots of examples of that. Even the 1998 agreement up here and the way that the language, it's very different to language you find in constitutions, because especially the annexes, which the treaty bit looks very like a treaty, but then the annex bit is all the strands, which is all the substantive bits, but it's written in the kind of legal but political, but sometimes slightly poetic, in that they're describing sort of an ideal. It's quite a utopian. I think the kind of almost owns its utopianism in the 1998 agreement more than same often constitutions. They do it. They try to hide it a bit more. Whereas I think that's an interesting example of one where kind of, it's all about hope and building somewhere that's, peaceful and where everyone can live and thrive. And it's very much, but it's an interesting, different kind of language. Like you have the treaty bit that's quite short, that's very like in treaty between the United Kingdom and Ireland, et cetera, et cetera. And then this annex, which is much more, because it's an annex, it's an add-on, but even though it's actually the important bits, it's got this different tenor and language to it that I think allows it, or maybe obviously it wasn't writing it, and the people who would be able to answer a bit better, but almost kind of a license to be a bit more, because it was about hope.
Yeah, because it's a work of imagination, right? Like both, like that agreement and any constitution has to be like somewhat a work of imagination, because you're imagining something into existence that hasn't existed before.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by, they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. Like, of course, they knew what they were doing, but that there's an element of the unknown. And perhaps there is room within that kind of unknown or space of imagination for a type of language that is not kind of what we know as kind of pure legal language, which seems to be what you're describing in that agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think we often understand constitution as kind of a very directional language, in terms of the way in which it sets up particular institutions and outlines particular roles and responsibilities or duties and powers. And yet, as you said, for you, poetry is the language of inquiry. And perhaps if we saw them as, or read them as poems, or read them with the potential to have that line of inquiry, and thinking through what might be possible and questioning what might be possible within the Constitution, as you say, they do have that kind of utopian potential for reimagining what we might understand as the state.
Thank you both so much. Thank you so much, Julie, for coming in and agreeing to chat to us. And thank you, Ruth, as well, for joining the conversation. It was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.